This week, one of the biggest propaganda myths pushed by the West about China in Africa has just been completely debunked. And the most ironic part, it was debunked not by China or some random guy on social media, but by the West's own institutions and empirical data from the IMF. In this video, we're breaking down why the so-called China debt trap narrative in Africa is a total lie. We'll look into the real differences between Chinese and Western debt in the continent and uncover the true motivations behind this deception. If you care about protecting Africa's growth from manipulative global narratives, especially ones that sound convincing but ultimately harm Africa's development, then this video is for you. If you don't know me, my name is TJ, I'm Nigerian and British mixed, and on this channel, we talk about African geopolitics. So just a few days ago, an article quietly published outside the mainstream spotlight revealed explosive new statements from a Western professor that completely debunked the myth of Chinese debt in Africa. Let's take a look at that article together. No evidence of China debt trap in Africa, says EAI director at Accra Forum. The notion of a China debt trap in Africa is not supported by empirical data, according to analysis presented during the Africa-China dialogue hosted by the Africa Center for Policy and Advisory, ACCPA, at the CEIBS Africa campus in Accra. Delivering the keynote presentation, Professor Alfred Schipke, director of East Africa Institute, EAI, at the National University of Singapore, provided insights from the newly launched IMF-backed volume, Africa-China Linkages, Building Deeper and Broader Connections, which he co-edited. His presentation challenged prevailing Western narratives that portray Chinese lending as predatory, suggesting instead that Africa's debt challenges are shaped by multiple factors, including global economic shifts, domestic fiscal pressure, and structural constraints. The presentation emphasized that while some African countries do face growing debt burdens, there is no systematic evidence that China deliberately engages in coercive lending practices. Rather, Chinese financing was shown to be among several sources of external debt, with Chinese creditors often willing to restructure or renegotiate terms in line with macroeconomic realities on the continent. So there you have it, no empirical data, no evidence at all. But let's be honest, as someone deeply rooted in Western institutions, he can only present this type of information in a very polished and diplomatic way. The real issue, and what truly exposes the darker side of this narrative, begins when you compare the nature of Western debt, particularly that of the World Bank and the IMF, to Chinese debt across Africa. I'm sure the IMF are fuming about the statements from Alfred here, because when the IMF and the World Bank lend to African nations, their loans come with suffocating strings attached, and there's a reason for that. They dictate how the money can be used, often banning funding for projects that actually grow the economy. And worse, they sometimes attach conditions that force African farmers, for example, into dependency on top of the loan itself. For example, some loans require produce to be grown using Monsanto seeds and then sold back at a set price to Monsanto through its networks to Western market. This locks the agricultural sector into a cycle of GMO dependency, where seeds cannot naturally reproduce, forcing countries to buy new seeds from Monsanto each season, along with fertilizers that degrade local ecosystems over time. These are the hidden chains that compound the debt trap, creating economic and ecological dependence. No power plants, no bridges, no factories, no schools, just roads from the mines or the farms to the port. Instead, these loans finance consumption, not production, trapping countries into a cycle of dependency where the only outcome of one IMF loan is another IMF loan. The bottom line is that Western debt is by design a neo-colonial structure. Its sole purpose is to prevent Africa from building its own manufacturing base, from achieving independent economic growth, and from ever becoming a true player on the global trade stage through the production of end goods and finished products. It's the modern day chain that ensures Africa remains a supplier, of raw materials, not value-added exports. In contrast, Chinese lending operates on an entirely different model. China doesn't hand over cash to African leaders who might pocket it or squander some of it or whatever. Instead, it provides credit directly to Chinese state-owned companies to build infrastructure within African nations. The money doesn't vanish into offshore accounts. It turns into physical assets, railways, highways, ports, power stations, and hospitals. Look at Nigeria, where China has financed major railway projects like the Abuja-Kaduna line and the Lagos-Ibadan standard gauge railway. Those are tangible developments, improving lives, slashing transport times, and stimulating trade. In Kenya, the Nairobi-Mombasa standard gauge railway cut down a trip that might take a whole day into 4 hours, fueling the movement of goods and igniting economic growth. That's not a debt trap, that's development. And this is precisely why there is such a massive incentive for the West to spread the narrative that China is predatory. It's a form of psychological warfare to keep Africans afraid of the very partnerships, because if Africa continues to take these fairer, more flexible loans from China, then it could finally begin to change its own circumstances, empowering its people, strengthening its economies, and gaining leverage at the global trade negotiating table. This type of shift might just be a problem for the West, considering that Africa holds 30% of the world's most critical minerals and natural resources. If Africa got its act together, it could completely rewrite the rules of global economics. Meanwhile, when Western creditors come calling, they demand the devaluation of currencies, higher taxes on essentials, and cuts to public spending, all to please bondholders in New York or London or Brussels. In Nigeria, the IMF's policies have doubled inflation, crushed the naira, and pushed millions into poverty. How do we know this? Because the IMF have been the major player for the last 30 years, whereas China is only a phenomenon in the last 10 or so. The hypocrisy is staggering. Western debt is built on the mentality of dominance, the idea that for the West to win, someone else must lose. The United States and its allies cannot imagine a world where prosperity is shared. They believe that if there's going to be a loser, it will never be them, rather than China's approach, on the other hand, that is rooted in mutual benefit. Its trade philosophy is simple. Let's look for win-win opportunities. If everyone prospers, everyone wins. China wants to trade based on value, not ideology, and it consistently shows flexibility in restructuring debts when nations actually face difficulty. Out of all the African countries that have become indebted to China, only one major default has occurred, and that's in Zambia. Every other time, Beijing has opted for renegotiation, not punishment. It seems like someone isn't being honest about Chinese debt trap, because the truth is simple. Western debt keeps Africa weak and dependent, while Chinese debt, for all of its flaws, is at least building something tangible: roads, energy, and opportunity. And I think basically Africa doesn't believe this lie anymore. Perhaps the lie in the West is more to appease its own people, to justify its predatory actions in the continent itself. The everyday African sees the new airports, sees the benefit of the railways, sees the benefit of the new roads. They buy Chinese phones, they use Chinese TVs, install Chinese air conditioning. And like I mentioned in one of my recent videos, there's about to be a tsunami of Chinese cars entering the African market, totally disrupting Western car manufacturers importing into the continent right now. So the next time you hear the words China debt trap, remember this: the real trap was built in Europe and America, not Beijing. I would love to know what you guys think about this. Please leave your thoughts in the comments. But if you have nothing to say, would it be too much if I asked you to write the words "no more debt traps"? It just lets me know that you watched the video to the end, you like what I'm producing, and you want me to continue. Thank you so much for watching today, and I'll catch you in the next one. Peace.